Hey everybody, and welcome to week 3 of our Intro to Blender. We're going to be talking about modular environments and specifically taking a deeper dive into how we can create environments but think about building them in pieces so we can work a lot faster. So of course, Monday, which this year falls on Memorial Day, there's no specific class in here, but what I wanted to dive into is today's topic, modeling, thinking about modularity. So we kind of talked about it a little bit last week where we thought about building our rocks out and how we could rotate them, finish them around, reuse them in multiple spots. We could use the same model once. Well, when we're thinking about modeling with buildings, it's in some ways easier to understand and more complicated, but essentially a good modular kit should be able to build an entire scene. So modularity is a lot like Lego blocks or anything else that kind of snaps together piecewise. We can think about buildings as pieces we can snap together that are evenly sized and actually fit together in predictable ways, so that when we're creating levels, or level designers are creating levels, or whoever are creating environments, we can iterate and make them really quickly. We also have to repeat ourselves a lot. So for instance, these windows are 4 variations on 4 different windows. However, this piece of wall or this grating or even this air conditioning unit might be repeated times. So why model it over and over and over again? The idea is, how can we be as efficient as possible with our time so we're not reusing things? And that said, in buildings, they try to make windows and doors and everything look uniform, look as even as possible. In fact, repetition is a big part of architecture. So it makes sense for us to try as best we can to make it as distinct pieces and then snap them together. So modularity doesn't just have to be, flat buildings that have pretty obvious areas that repeat, windows, fire escapes, doors, and things like that that obviously repeat. Other environments that are more natural have a lot of modularity to them. When if you start to look more closely, you can start to see elements repeat over and over again around on this scene and how they can be laid out. Every single movie you've played or watched that has a huge scene, modular pieces all snap together. Every video game you ever play that's a big 3D environment, no matter how organic it looks, is modular pieces that are all rearranged and snapped together in some way. So good modularity is resource and time efficient. You're going to save computing resources because for the computer, if you make, for instance, these rooms all have tons of bookcases, but if you make one bookcase repeated everywhere else, the computer can just reference that original bookcase and it doesn't need to load in 100 variations on that bookcase. It just needs to load in a few and it saves computing space. So it makes your stuff more efficient. Good repetition, like good modularity, is subtle. So it's not too obvious that, for instance, in this library, if one of these books was a big orange or magenta book, we saw that same book repeat over and over again. That would be bad modularity. We would see, obviously, that stuff repeating over and over again. But it can also be reused for lots of stuff. Materials or textures. One of my favorite anecdotes is in the game Skyrim. The little side tables are actually bookshelves that they just pushed into the ground, and it works just fine because you never see it through the ground. So they didn't make a separate model, they just used it somewhere else. It lets you make new environments on the fly and quickly. Let's say, again, you're doing an animated movie and they say the hallway needs to be longer. Well, if you thought modularly, you can just add more hallway. No problem. Or again, in the level design example, they change the layout of the level a little bit. Well, with modularity, it shouldn't be too much problem. And it allows another artist or designer or someone else should be able to take your kit and work on modules. That way, if you're working in a big team of people and you're all building pieces, all your pieces should snap together and function together. So this is actually one environment that I really love by Vladimir Lipotic. I really recommend checking his ArtStation. His breakdown on this particular library is incredible. And you look at this whole environment, and if you thought about like modeling this, you'd be like, that's way too much work. That is incredibly daunting. And it is. There's a lot of stuff in here. However, this is everything in the scene. All of it. And it looks surprising that all of this came from just these things. But in fact, if you start looking closer at any other element, this light fixture, it's just that. Even all these books, they've just created sections of books for stacks of books. So as there's stacks of books, they're rotating in different ways. It's hard to tell it's the same 4 stacks of books. But you start looking closer, it starts to become more obvious. So you can look closely and see all of the features, maybe one key feature in here, this little warping telepod thing, but everything else is just the same asset repeated over and over again. Ceiling piece up here, same ceiling, every room. Good lighting, good repetition, good laying out, made a very complicated environment out of a relatively simple number of pieces. A lot of them just flat with good texturing on. Bad modularity looks a little bit more like this. For instance, you maybe have some textures on a surface, but they tile really poorly or obviously. And these things become jarring, or things look inconsistent, or elements don't fit together. Anything that we can see that doesn't look efficient or like there's gaps in between your pieces would all be bad modularity. One of the ways we can get good modularity is by thinking about the grid. Again, think about Lego blocks. The innovation of Lego was they were able to make plastic toy bricks with incredible engineering specificity, so that if you take a Lego block from 70 years ago and one that you buy off the store shelf today, they still snap together. It might not sound like a lot, but from an engineering standpoint, that's incredible and very, very rare. Only usually like scientific instruments have that level of specific tolerance. But for that same reason, when we're working on the grid, we want a precision, a number of units that it works with. And there is a grid in Unreal, in Unity, in Blender, in Maya. Almost every 3D modeling program has some grid to work with. And working on that grid is a nice, predictable way to work. We don't want things overlapping. Sometimes you see this kind of bleed where it's the blue bleeding into white. This is called Z-fighting sometimes, but it's the idea that these two objects are right on top of each other and the computer's confused about which is over top of the other because they're precisely on top of each other, so it kind of guesses. Or there's a gap and we can see seams in the walls, which we don't want. We want to make sure we keep things relatively even in scale and units. So if you're going to make the walls a certain number of units, make the floors the same number of units so everything fits and snaps together. Another thing you really want to think about are origins of objects. So the origin is where that object scales and rotates and pivots from, and it's usually denoted by a little orange dot. In this case, I've actually increased the sizes of those origins so that you can see them a little bit better. On these walls, I like to almost always on a flat wall like this, place that dot at the lower corner of that object so that I can always snap another one that corner right there and it fits them. And as I go up in levels, I can always snap one to another. These little corner pieces, which are meant to be side walls for the building, sort of cover up the gaps, I have those pivots in a similar location so it would actually line up with these wall pieces. These trim pieces, however, I put the pivot at the top and in this here in the corner, because if I want to scale this down a little bit or adjust it or scale it out, I'm doing so knowing it's going to sit on top of this piece and I want it to line up. And then this piece, I want to fit into that corner. So as I turn a corner here, they all fit together. We think about this when we're creating especially modular pieces because their object origin is maybe one of its most important features. There's a couple ways to set this, and I'll show you how to do that right now. So I'm in here, and let's just create a simple mesh, and I'm going to start with a plane. And this simple plane right here could be the start of a building. And I want to show you in just literally, I don't know, a minute or two, you can time me, how quickly I could make an entire building out of one object. So what I want to do first is I want to straighten this up. So I'm going to rotate this X of 90. So we're looking at it straight up here. Let's go straight on. And then I want to go GZ1, which moves it up 1. And we're going to go GX -1, which shifts it over here. This kind of, I want to do it this way because you see it's like on the corner, and that's where I want the origin to be. So let's go ahead and set that origin. There's a bunch of ways to do this. I could go into the object, press 1 here, and hit Shift S and snap my cursor to world origin. And then when it's down there, I could select the object and in object, go to set origin and set origin to 3D cursor. We see it snaps down there now. Another way we could do this is actually taking this object and putting it back onto the center of the stage here. And then in edit mode, move it off so that the origin, when we're in edit mode, the origin doesn't move, so the origin is still there. That's another way to do it. Or my favorite way, and I think this is the best way, when you're in object mode, you have to be in object mode, you can go to options and click affect only origins. Also control period is the hotkey. And this, now when I press G, it doesn't move the object, it just moves its origin. So if I come up here to snapping and set it to like vertex, I can hit G, hold control, and then it will snap to different vert points. And then all I have to do is just turn it back off, and my origin, my pivot has changed. That up there is actually a new feature they added in 8.1, which is great. I'm really happy they did. Enough talk. Let's turn this into a building. I'm going to show you how. So real quick, I'm going to be in edit mode. I want to create a spot for a window because a window is a good thing to start with. I'm going to create the width of the window. I created Control R to make a little slice through it, and then Control B to bevel it. Now this is like the height of the window. So this is the relative area of the window, and then hit inset it to create a little space. And we'll keep it simple today. So I'm just going to push it back so you can see where that window is. And maybe I'll take these faces here and I'll push out a little bit with E. So we have that. It doesn't look like a lot, and certainly doesn't look like a big fancy building yet. But we've got a lot more we can do with this. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go maybe 2. I'm going to select this object here. I'm going to hit Shift D, which duplicates it. Right click back. E, and then extrude that up, because now I have this little piece right here. If you're ever having a hard time selecting these, this is that Z fighting thing. Sometimes you have to front back. Extrude that just along this axis. Select both these ends, and then I'm going to say scale X. And that just create like a little sill on it. Having a little trouble seeing the features, so something you can definitely do that I like to do when you're modeling is you can turn on cavity here. And if you set your cavity mode in this little look menu to something like both, it'll actually kind of give you a good sense where stuff is. Perfect. Just kind of janked up a little bit. I didn't want him to move up, but he did. Scale it down. All right, that's so this is an object, but here's what's cool about snapping. So if I take this D and I shift it over, we can see that I tend to open this up and I can look at my range, and if I'm at -2, these two objects are going to line up perfectly. I'm going to turn off that cavity and turn off outline, because that just shows the line in between them to show you that these would snap together perfectly. Now, of course, there's always an array way to do this, so I'm going to show you how to do that right now. So let's take add modifier, and I'm going to do an array. And instead of 1, I want to go across this way, so I'm going to say -1. And then every time I add more, it's going to create, let's turn on again, it's going to create more of these windows. And you can make an array of an array. So let's make another array. This time, instead of going 1, I want to go up, which in this case, I believe is in this axis. We haven't reset it. So right now, this axis thinks this is Y because it's all local. I can fix that by hitting Control A in object mode and reapplying all transform. So I want to 0 this one out, and I want to say relative of 1. Relative means it's like its own scale or its own size. So we see 1 over 1 up. And now I can make as many floors as I want. That's pretty cool, but what about making a whole building out of this? Well, again, there's always a thing for that. We could make another array, but it's hard to get arrays to turn corners. But that's where our locator comes in. So I'm going to make a locator like so. It's called an empty. And when I create it, it should just be, let's say, I didn't quite get that, empty, and we're going to make an empty plain axis. So it's that guy right here. I'm going to make another array, but this one is going to reference that empty. And I'm going to turn off relative offset, and I'm going to set this one, instead of changing it this way, I'm going to rotate Z 90. So this is going to be still on this object. Turn on offset, there it is. And but it's all the way over here. I want it back here, but that's okay. All I have to do is this object. Up here, I have it on vert snapping, so I can just hit G, and as we drag it out, and now it's not letting me snap these guys to vert, so I'm going to do it on increment. And I'm going to turn on what's called absolute grid snap, which is let me snap grids purely. And so now I've got that, and here's the best part because it remembers all of that. Boom, boom. You got yourself a building. And I can change any of these values if I want fewer or more floors to work with. And if I want more or less length along here, well, I just have to change the position of this guy. And, you know, of course, there's so much more we can do with this building stuff. I'm going to make a second video where I show you a couple other things we can add. That's it. I mean, in just literally a couple seconds, you can see that by thinking modularly and thinking connectedly, we can create a lot of really seemingly large and complicated things. Start looking at some stuff. Think about how you can break it down and where you see repeating features around your home or neighborhood. I'll see you in the next one.